You ready to talk about Stagecoach?
Happy to talk about Stagecoach or wherever the Western Trail takes us.
It's hard to encapsulate what makes Stagecoach so great, but for me, one of the most noteworthy parts is that intro with John Wayne.
Hold it! Whoa, steady, ho, ho.
When he spins the Winchester and it zooms in and there's like a slight change in his like, it's kind of a grimace almost.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the most famous introductions in the history of cinema. It's, of course, not the first time audiences had seen John Wayne. They'd seen a lot of John Wayne up to this point, dozens of B-Westerns by this point. But the way that scene is constructed, you kind of get a sense that there's a sound off screen. We go outside, we see characters looking at something, we cut to what they're looking at, and then we get that remarkable push in where there's even a moment where it goes out of focus and then back in focus. Tells us that this is maybe a different John Wayne. And your observation about the grimace is a really good one, that there's a kind of darkness to this character lurking beneath the kind of the boyishness, or even the cocking of the rifle as a kind of playful gesture, in some way kind of ostentatious, and that is an important part of the character for the rest of the movie. And you could argue that that's an important part of who John Wayne is for the rest of his career. Somebody who has a kind of a world weariness, has seen things, kind of has an inner darkness, and yet feels compelled to do the right thing.
So that was the end of his career in B movies?
No, it wasn't.
Oh.
That's the funny thing. People sometimes talk about Stagecoach as the movie that relaunched Wayne's career. Quite famously, or maybe infamously, he was in a film in 1930 called The Big Trail. That was the first movie where he got the name John Wayne. It's Marion Morrison by birth. And that film was intended to launch him as a superstar, but it did not do very well for a variety of reasons. So he spends the rest of the 30s making B-Westerns for studios like Republic. So in 39, he's still under contract to Republic. So he keeps making B-Westerns for the next, I think, 5 years or so. It's really not until, I would say, Red River is kind of the next real turning point in his career, when he's unquestionably an A-list star, one of the biggest, if not the biggest star in the world.
What an interesting one for him to become a star after with Red River, because that's kind of like the Duke is ambiguous as a character.
Well, I think there's some continuity there. A number of biographers of Wayne have sort of zeroed in on Red River as the moment that he kind of establishes the template for a lot of his later roles, where he's sort of, he's playing an older man in that point, which he would grow into over the course of the next 2 decades. He's sort of, as I said, that melancholy figure, world weary, but also the guide to younger men, a kind of reluctant authority figure. And he plays variations of that particular character in most of his best known roles from the mid-40s on.
I love the episode of How the West Was Cast that you guys did on Hondo.
Thank you.
What a cool movie. So we're kind of getting off track.
Yeah.
It, like you said, let's follow the trail. So where would that have been? Was that 50s, late 50s, Hondo?
So that's early 50s. I mean,
early 50s.
That's an interesting movie. That's a movie that Wayne produced himself, where he's kind of playing a familiar man who knows Indians type character. It was very popular around that time. But again, that kind of idea of a man who has suffered great loss and finds himself, though, in a position where he needs to protect people and also mentor a younger man, in this case a boy. A really important film in Wayne's filmography, no question about it. And Hondo is a film that Wayne would point to as one of his favorites over the rest of his career. A lot of sentimental attachment to that picture.
So with Stagecoach, back to Stagecoach, is where does this stand in the timeline of Ford and Wayne?
Ford and Wayne. So, Ford and Wayne meet each other in the late 1920s. Wayne has some small roles in early Ford pictures, but the standard narrative, and there are people who offer alternatives, is that Ford took great offense when Wayne took Raoul Walsh up on his offer to be the lead in The Big Trail. And Ford and Wayne have an interesting relationship, would be one way to put it. Kind of adversarial, but one of great respect. I think it's telling that Wayne called Ford Coach, because I think that's something of the relationship. So this is a moment where, in one telling, Ford is letting Wayne come back into the fold. That he has a role for him. It's in an ensemble, so it's not really the protagonist in the sense of getting the most screen time or anything like that. And Wayne at that point wasn't the most famous actor in the picture. Claire Trevor gets top billing. Thomas Mitchell is very famous at that point. But this is the moment that kind of rekindles something that had begun, and continues on. But again, I'll tell the famous story about Red River, where supposedly after Wayne makes Red River, Ford is shown the picture by Hawks, and he says something effective. I never knew that dumb son of a bitch could act. And it's after that point that we begin to get pictures like The Searchers, for example, with Ford and Wayne, or The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. But you can't overstate the importance of Stagecoach in reestablishing what is the most famous and most important actor-director combination in the history of Western movies.
So, and you touched on something that is really special about Stagecoach, and that is the ensemble.
Yeah.
What is that? I mean, it had been done before, and it's been done in every genre really since. But
Yeah.
What's unique about the way Stagecoach does it?
Yeah. Well, I may get this wrong, but I believe on the poster for the film Stagecoach, the theatrical release poster, the tagline is "A powerful story of 9 strange people," which is a strange tagline for a Western. It's not what you're expecting, right? It isn't a thrilling adventure of the Old West or something like that. A powerful tale of 9 strange people. So the context there is important. Around this time, sort of mid to late 30s, Hollywood was really big on ensemble dramas, and was big on trying to find stories where you could get a big cast, a couple of big names, but a lot of supporting characters, and confine them in a particular location for the duration of the movie so as to create some drama.
How about the other lady?
Thanks.
Sorry. No silver cups.
So Grand Hotel is a famous example of this. So Stagecoach, in a way, is Grand Hotel out west, where we get this eclectic cast of characters, and we find a narrative conceit that will keep them together, people who wouldn't ordinarily be together in the same location for a prolonged period of time. So that, in a way, makes Stagecoach a kind of different Western, because it's not like the Westerns that follow. The Imperiled Stagecoach doesn't become one of the great conventional Western stories. It's not the story of the righteous lawman, or the anti-hero outlaw, or the wagon train, or the building of the railroad, or the pioneers. It's very unique in that respect. But it is also important for the Western because of those characters. A few years ago, Cowboys and Indians magazine redid their list of top 100 Western movies. And the senior film writer there is Joe Layton, who's a friend of mine. And I had him on my podcast, and I asked him about something in particular that happened when he redid the list. So what he did is he made Stagecoach, in his view, the greatest Western ever, and put The Searchers down to number 2.
Oh.
That's what I thought. Very controversial. So, I of course confronted him about this. And, his response, in part, and this is a great point, is that in the Stagecoach you have so many of the conventional Western characters that we would come to associate with the genre. Now, they didn't establish these character types, but they certainly, cemented, or maybe crystallized is a better word, them. So you have all of them there, and even though they don't necessarily appear together in the same configuration, they kind of, propagate or proliferate in the Western from this point on. So in terms of influence and that in particular, the characters, the themes, difficult to overstate the significance.
And as we've talked about before, there's also a connection to some sort of archetype that existed in the West. Do you want to maybe go through some of the ensemble? I can ask you a question. So Doc Boone.
Jerry, I'll admit as one man to another that economically I haven't been of much value to you, but suppose you could put one on credit?
If talk was money, Doc, you'd be the best customer I got.
Yes.
Interesting character. I feel like there must have been an archetypal doctor who, town drunk / doctor.
Yeah.
Everybody turns him. And it's also a figure you see a lot in Ford movies.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, in general, Ford is much more interested in society's outcasts.
We're the victims of a foul disease called social prejudice, my child. These dear ladies of the Law and Order League are scouring out the dregs of the town.
And it's such that he finds ways to make characters who in a different Western could be an upstanding member of society, the town doctor, into an outcast, whose first appearance, we see him inebriated, we see him being kicked out of town. So Ford has a particular facility with that. And it's something that other filmmakers, later filmmakers, pick up on, and it kind of makes historical sense because if you're a physician, you had access to alcohol and other drugs. So like the laudanum abusing doctor, the ether abusing doctor, we see that in later westerns. See it a little bit, and even in Deadwood.
Fine member of the medical profession. Drunken beast.
But it makes what could be a very stock character into a much more complex one. And that's what Ford is really good at, and that's what the best Westerns do. You can't say enough good things about Thomas Mitchell's performance, though.
Yeah.
It is so moving, the pathos. I mean, we just have a great deal of sympathy for this character who, has a great moment of triumph in the film where he is able to overcome his vices in the name of a higher calling, maybe the highest calling in his profession. But Ford is not the type of filmmaker to suggest that all of a sudden the character is better, right? He begins, drinking immediately. He kind of descends back into the morass where we found him initially. It's really, quite remarkable. And then, he continues to have that rise and fall arc. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, and it's so, it's comedic too the whole time. That them holding him up in the kitchen and just shoving coffee at him.
Yeah.
And I noticed Ford has a lot of boozy humor.
Yes. Yeah. Boozy humor. That's a good way of putting it. I mean, one of the most, I suppose, criticized aspects of Ford's films is his preference for a kind of broad humor, slapstick humor, humor that is based in what some might perceive to be ethnic stereotypes.
You can find another wife.
Sure, I can find another wife, but you take my rifle and my horse? Oh, I never sell her. I love her so much. I beat it with a whip, and she never get tired.
Your wife?
No, my horse.
A lot of scenes that revolve around drunkenness and drinking and things of that nature. And some people see these moments as kind of weaknesses of his movies, but I see them more as his interest in trying to provide us with fully fleshed out characters, three-dimensional characters who can have moments of sadness and moments of happiness and moments of embarrassment and so on, and that makes for more interesting characters. So is Doc Boone as compelling a character if he isn't drunkenly reciting Shakespeare at different moments, or insulting people. I mean, we get that, but then we also get these moments of great sadness and pathos. I mean, that's the richness of human experience that Ford is very skilled at offering audiences.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember very early in my writing career, and talking to creative writing coaches and mentors and all that, they always told us, be careful not to dial up each character too high.
Right.
And Ford pulls this on, and I say Ford because it doesn't really exist in the Haycox story as dramatically, as intensely.
No.
But he turned every single character, even Andy Devine's character, which I'd love to talk about in a second.
Yeah.
If there's anything I don't like, it's driving a stagecoach through Apache country.
Oh, every one of them is just, even Curly, everyone is top notch. Very intense characters.
It is, and in a film that's less than 2 hours long, I think.
Yeah,
it's pretty remarkable how how fully fleshed out the characters are, and again, I think it's that balance of what a recognizable genre like the Western makes possible, that we see a character type and we think, okay, well, we're familiar with this, like we're bringing some information, so there's a certain economy in the storytelling that maybe you don't have to do as much to establish who this character might be or what the profession is, because you can rely on the audience's knowledge. And then that frees you up to spend more time, on the nuances, sort of on the complexities. And he does that with really every character trapped in that stagecoach has a kind of arc where they get a comeuppance, they get redemption, they get a moment of heroism. It's really deftly handled because as you would know, it's hard to tell a story with a lot of characters and do them all justice, which is why we see it so infrequently.
Yeah, Tarantino obviously watched Stagecoach.
Yeah, in preparation for The Hateful Eight, no question about that. I mean, and that's same kind of thing. How do we get all of these disparate characters trapped in a dramatic situation for a certain period of time? And there the answer isn't so much the stagecoach as the snowbound way station, but similar in many respects. Yeah,
Far more violent.
Well, there's a difference between what you could do in 1939 and what you can do in more recent times.
So let's talk Andy Devine.
Please.
What a fascinating actor, and he kind of plays the same character with a lot of exceptions, but
Yeah, no, he does, and he pops up in many of Ford's films. I mean, Devine is he's a character actor, and he has a signature attribute, and that is his voice. So he you hear that voice. There's a very few actors. Maybe Walter Brennan is another where you hear the voice and you think, okay, well I know who that is, and they're called character actors for a reason, because they tend to play similar characters, but similar is not the same. And Devine he's a different sort of character in Stagecoach than when he's playing Cookie as a sidekick to Roy Rogers or something like that. He's also he's a different character in some ways in a Stagecoach than he is in a later picture like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. There's a kind of sense that he was a certain character. He's kind of a comic relief who brings attention to because of his nature, that he seems to be concerned with the superficial, and he seems very cowardly and so on. The point of that character is to help provide a contrast with some of the other characters, while still providing his moment of heroism. His character in Stagecoach, he's still he's wounded, he's still driving the stagecoach, one-armed, like he still gets his moment of heroism. But broadly, I mean, Devine was there to be the comic relief and to help us appreciate the more stoic qualities, let's say, in some of the people he found himself around. But I mean, a great performer.
Oh, so good. And like so much of his humor is just it's understated why, and it's kind of hidden under that voice and that shtick.
Yeah.
So he and Ford kind of butted heads on set, right?
That's my understanding. Yes.
Okay, I heard the story about Ford was just kind of going at him about guiding the horses, and he said, "Hey, Ward Bond can't do what I'm doing right here," and John Ford kind of backed off.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, he's obviously, actors are not the characters that they play. Sometimes they have a vested interest in making us believe that there's some continuity between who they are and what we see, because we want to believe we're getting something authentic as opposed to a great, performance, a piece of deceptive artifice, something like that. But I mean, yeah, Devine could hold his own, and this is one of any number of anecdotes about Ford, who, he would push people. He would push them and needle them, and he would berate them. And very often it worked, but he would often get actors to this sort of moment where they would finally say enough, and they would push back, and that's the moment where you probably had earned Ford's respect. Now, today we recognize there are many problems with that type of leadership style.
Yeah.
But in the case of Devine, this was a guy who was able to stand up, and then he has a very long and productive relationship with Ford after this. I mean, he's in almost every Ford Western.
And it's also not unusual. Like, Kubrick was notorious for basically bullying some of his actors.
Yeah. Well, and Hitchcock falls into that vein too. And there are complexities here, because if you were to if you were to talk to some of the actors, they wouldn't see it the same way as some observers did in terms of the relationships being abusive. But this is one of the challenging things about film history. Like, there's a particular dynamic on set with great directors, and this isn't unique to film. This was in the theater as well, dance, other arts. This idea that you needed not to encourage, but to kind of berate people, to get them in a state where they could push themselves, where you could break down certain barriers. I mean, controversial by today's standards. But I always go back to the fact that when these people looked back on their relationships, working with these directors, whether it's a Kubrick or a Hitchcock, most of the time, they tell a very different story than sort of a straightforward one of hierarchy and abuse and so on. I mean, there are nuances to human relationships. They're complex and troubled, and that's certainly the case with artists, maybe more so. Maybe more so than us regular folks.
There we go. Yeah, I like what you said about the relationship between Wayne and Ford being sort of like a coach and a player.
Yeah.
Because that makes sense. You see that sort of like chewing out drill sergeant like power relationship between them, but also geared towards, I'm going to make you better.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, maybe this sounds like an excuse, but it's the idea that Ford saw something in Wayne. Maybe he didn't see it as clearly until Howard Hawks had coaxed an amazing performance out of him. But he saw something, and they developed a relationship where he knew how to get great performances out of Wayne. And I think Wayne understood that when he was working with Ford, he was going to be better, and so he allowed Ford to get away with things that maybe very few other directors could get away with. Maybe Wellman, maybe Hawks to a lesser degree. But that's Wayne is a willing participant in this. He understands the nature of the collaboration, and it's hard to argue with what we see on screen. I mean, the Wayne we see in Stagecoach is in many ways the Wayne of Republic serials, like of the Three Mosquitoes. Many of those B movies do have hints of that darkness, but Ford brings it out in his direction. His understanding that for example, characters can convey more just with a glance. There's some really important moments in Stagecoach, and also in later films like The Searchers, where all Wayne does is he kind of just stares off into space. He just sort of looks. And Wayne has talked about this as something that Ford encouraged, that he would play some mood music off set, which maybe is a layover from Ford's silent days, and he would tell him just kind of like look and feel, and in those moments, when the Ringo Kid is sitting on the floor of the stagecoach, and he's sort of staring off into space, he's sort of contemplating the horrible deed that he has to do to rectify the injustice against him. I mean, there are few moments in cinema just as powerful as that glance. And that's one of a number of glances, right? That goes back to that introduction where we have that look on his face, and the dialogue is minimal. I mean, that's the mark of a great filmmaker, doing something with variations and getting an amazing sensitive performance out of an actor that many wouldn't think was capable of that.
I like use of that word sensitive too, because it's a mix of that, and you can see death on his face a couple times.
Oh, that's a great point. Yes.
He realizes that his father and his brother are dead, and he's got to kill two people or three brothers in order to rectify those deaths.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I mean, and that's the tragedy of the Western. I often bring this up when people tell me that Westerns are just straightforward triumphalist narratives. The Western hero is a fundamentally tragic character, usually because he's, as you said, he's sort of marked by violence and death, and then he needs to exact some kind of vengeance. But because of his association with violence and death, he actually has no place in the society that he's often helping to bring into being. And Stagecoach is a great example. I mean, spoiler alert for those who haven't seen it, but at the end of the movie, I mean, so basically, the movie, we start in one town, which seems to be full of sanctimonious busybodies, and then we arrive in another town that does seem to have some law and order, but they quickly disappear, and it seems to be populated solely by like gangsters and whores, and as a kind of encouraging vision of what the nascent frontier civilization is going to become, neither is very attractive, and so at the end of the movie, you have the hero and heroine leaving society, for Mexico, saved from the blessings of civilization, as Doc Boone puts it, right? So there's, again, this kind of great tragedy and darkness in the Western, going back to these early films, these early sound films like Stagecoach.
But even in that kind of topsy-turvy dynamic where, escaping the law is the law and it all gets thrown around.
Yeah.
Just like the way that, to me, Ford uses black and white in a way that's very colorful.
Yeah.
It's so funny that would be their freedom, that they would. That's the law and order aspect to it, and his ability for irony, like you were saying, the ladies of the Law and Order League.
Yeah. There's no shortage in Westerns of temperance leagues that are sanctimonious and hypocritical. The last time we talked, you asked me about sort of the depiction of religion or Christianity in the Western, and I think I kind of fumbled that answer. But when I thought about it, there aren't a lot of great depictions of preachers, for example, in Westerns, and I think there's a sort of a general sense, definitely in Ford's films, maybe other great Westerns, that the institutions of man are corruptible, because we ourselves are all fallen and we're sinners, and so we can't help but make institutions that are going to be likewise corrupt. I think most Westerns are about this, and at the same time they invoke this idea of a kind of a higher authority, like a cosmic justice, that there are these moments when great men of skill and violence are. They're not so much taking the law into their own hands. They're kind of exacting a type of justice that can't exist on the earthly plane because it's been corrupted, something like that. But again, that is like a deeply sad and troubling implication of the Western, and yet we see it time and time and time again. And I find it just fascinating, these kind of nuances.
Well, I agree, and that's a great transition to another character that I find fascinating, which is the whiskey drummer, whose name I forgot. So that's perfect, because nobody remembers his name. Nobody
Yeah.
remembers his occupation.
Yeah, so it's so the actor is Donald Meek, and the character is Peacock.
Peacock. That's
From
wow.
Kansas City,
that-
Kansas.
Kansas.
Yeah,
And he's got weird Freudian slips, but he's also this like kind of beautiful character. He scolds all the men when they're around the baby,
yes.
even though he's this like meek, mushy character who lets some drunken doctor drink all his booze.
Yeah. Now you have timid, nervous. Another great performance that comes out in the stutters, the slips, the inability in most cases to stand up to Doc Boone. Interesting character, the whiskey drummer again, who could be a very conventional character, but we kind of get in the guise here of the guy who's nominally from the East, even though he keeps making the distinction that he's not from Kansas City, Missouri, he's from Kansas City, Kansas. Right? And we understand that one is East and one is West, baby. So he's at least conceptualizing himself in this way. And he again has one of these great moments where he becomes the kind of conscience of the picture at a particular junction. But that is followed up with when they're crossing the desert and the wind is blowing and they're all caked in dust and Boone has started drinking again.
Please, come.
Any parting word? Oh, I know what I wanted to ask about. The role of Ernest Haycox's writing in the movie
Yeah.
and in the Western genre, the Western film genre.
Yeah, so Ernest Haycox was a prolific writer, mostly of short stories, especially in the 30s and 40s, but before and after that. I think he has over 300 credits to his name. He wrote mostly in Collier's Weekly in the 30s and then switched over to the Saturday Evening Post. And he, there's a writer named Richard A. Tulane has written a really good book about Haycox. So if people are interested in him, that's the book to read. He makes the case that what Haycox was able to do is kind of elevate the Western from a sort of formulaic and somewhat lowbrow form of popular fiction to something that was more sophisticated and respectable. And he did that in a number of ways. His attention to historical details was somewhat different. His interest in three-dimensional characters, let's say. So he's a major figure in the popularization of not only the Western but a particular type of Western that lent itself well to serious cinema in some cases. So Stage to Lordsburg was a story published in Collier's magazine in 1937. Probably his most famous work is the basis for Stagecoach. And as you mentioned earlier, the movie is different than the story in many ways. It's cinematic in ways that the story is not, but very important. Let's see, Troubleshooter was a story from 1936 that becomes serialized as Union Pacific, another Western
Same
released
year.
in 1939. Exactly.
Yeah.
So in this important year for Western movies, it's telling that two of those movies have their inspiration, let's say, in the work of this one great writer.
That's fantastic. Any final words on Stagecoach? We barely touched it.
Yeah.
We dove in deep. We had a deep discussion and just barely touched the surface.
Yeah, well, I think it's it's an important film. I think there's so many stories told about it. Maybe the one to end on is with the Orson Welles anecdote, where famously Orson Welles in his early 20s was in the late 1930s given kind of an unprecedented contract by RKO Studios to make movies. He had proven himself as kind of wonderkind of the theater and was given almost complete authorial agency over the production of a film. And he, of course, had very limited experience with motion pictures, and yet was able to turn out Citizen Kane,
Wow.
which many would argue is the greatest film of all time. And when Wells would be asked, how did you learn to make movies? He would say that he just watched Stagecoach over and over and over again. So by there you have Orson Welles telling you that essentially everything you need to know about making movies is in Stagecoach, and I think there's something to that. It is very easy to go to find one particular thing about the film and to go very deep, and then you begin making connections between that one thing and other things, and you understand just how thoughtful and sophisticated the picture is. So it may not be as good as The Searchers, but it is hard to name many westerns better than Stagecoach.
I like that. I like that a lot. That's a good summary. Thank you, Andrew. Your insight is invaluable.
It's my pleasure. Happy to talk about westerns anytime, Kevin, and thank you for writing about them.